Okay, good morning, everyone, or good evening for some of you, and welcome to our 26th event in the ICSVE series of Zoom panel discussions discussing various issues of terrorism and violent extremism. We're excited again to welcome all of you, professionals signed up from all over the world. I didn't get to check the list carefully, so I don't know, Molly, do you want to welcome the unusual countries?
Oh, I didn't check either.
Okay. We were both busy, sorry. In our last event, we had Major General Shafa and Maji Peterex speak on Safe Corridor and other rehabilitation and prevention efforts taking place in Nigeria. It was a really interesting discussion about Boko Haram, but applicable to other places and other groups. If you missed that event or any of our previous 25 Zoom events looking at issues of terrorist prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, and reintegration, you can still watch those recordings. They're all posted on our ICSVE website under events, and TM Garrett is making them look really nice, so we're excited about that. And you can also view our 265 short counter-narrative videos, which feature ISIS, al-Shabaab insiders, as well as a growing library of 50 former white supremacists and far-right members denouncing the violent groups that they were part of. And that's all on our ICSVE YouTube channel. I'm just noticing somebody's Northern Lights. My God, Malik Larson, that is a beautiful picture. Sorry for being distracted. So we're posting the links to these in the chat if you'd like to see them later. And I always say before we begin, and especially today, since we are talking about religious issues, that we really welcome having this World Forum. We love to leave the chat open, and we want you to be active in the chat, saying your opinions, your thoughts, putting your questions. And we value that so much that we publish it after the event, because we think very many of you have great thoughts and great things to say. But we have to remember that we come from a worldwide audience and that we have different views, different cultures, different religions. So we really put a strong emphasis that we cannot abide by anybody insulting another person's religion, race, or ethnicity. So if you came to be a troll, we will boot you out, and we have learned how to do that. As per our usual practice, we do capture all the chat, and we try to briefly answer any questions posed that weren't answered in the Zoom conference after the event. And we mail that around to everyone later in the day or the next day, depending on how fast we are, along with the website posting of today's video recording. And we will open the mic for some of you, but we may not be able to get to everyone. And we do voice questions from the chat. I always like to thank our larger ICSVE team today, because it's not only me, although I'm being the host right now. And I like to thank the people that have made this work possible, which include the US State Department, USAID, and who we also consult with, US Justice Department, ICTAP, FBI, US Homeland Defense, Department of Defense, as well as international organizations like OSCE, UNCTAD, UN Women, etc. We're very proud to have consulted and worked with many of those and had funding from some of them. We're also supported by foreign governments from the Northeast Syria government, which is not recognized, Iraq, Jordan, European and Balkan countries, and the European Union, who we worked with, as well as the United States, of course. Our current sponsors are US State Department, Facebook, private donors, and the state of Qatar. And we're really grateful to each of our sponsors and thank them every time we have a Zoom conference. And I always especially thank the state of Qatar for supporting our Breaking the ISIS Brand counter-narrative project, because they made it possible that we now have 273 in-depth interviews of ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners, and another 16 of al-Shabaab. And from these, we have created 250 short video clips of terrorist defectors, returnees, and prisoners denouncing ISIS. If everybody would mute, that would be nice. As un-Islamic, corrupt, and overly brutal. And as I said, we have just completed 50 white supremacist research interviews from which we are writing research reports. You can find those on our website, and we're beginning to make short counter-narrative videos from them as well. Our video clips are made by TM Garrett, Sheikh Ali. Some were made by Zach Bedorf, who now has gone to State Department, and myself working in concert. And we tried to subtitle them in all the languages that these groups recruit in. So we have worked in about 27 different languages. And then we're also very proud to be partnered with Facebook, because Facebook helps us to distribute them over Facebook and Instagram. And Molly Ellenberg runs all of those campaigns and studies their effect, and has informed us that we need to have shorter videos, only 1 minute long. And we study how far they reach, how long they're watched, what the comments to them are, and so on. So, and if you signed up to this event, you are on our mailing list. So I hope we don't irritate you with that, and you can always unsubscribe. So our question today is, what is the role of imams and Islamic scholars in preventing and countering radicalization to militant jihadist violent extremism? And for those of us that have been around for a very long time, we know that the UK in particular made programs way back when it was just Al-Qaeda that we were dealing with. And they made a lot of websites, they funded groups, and the idea was to cognitively argue against takfir ideologies, which we'll hear what that is in a little bit. And I think that was all good. And they argued about big jihad, little jihad, these kind of things, whether you have to take hijra, although hijra was not a real big claim in those years. And but the emphasis was on cognitive arguments. And what I argued for years and years and years, way back when, was that Al-Qaeda is so emotional in their appeal, and now ISIS in their appeal, and Al-Shabaab. And they're very good at showing grievances, things that happen in war zones, and pairing it with beautiful music from Islam and distorted, twisted scriptures from Islam, and telling people this is your Islamic duty to join our group and to fight against the West. And so my view was we need to talk back to terrorists using their same methods and engaging people's emotions, and for all of our counter speech to have an emotional balance to it so it would catch people. So that's where Breaking the ISIS Brand came from, that we decided if you have an actual insider speak, that's really powerful, it's hard to discredit. And if you pair it with music, we don't use nasheeds, but if you pair it with music, and if you show the grievances that they're speaking about and tell their story in a really compelling way so that other people that are listening to ISIS or attracted to ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab would start to engage emotionally, they might listen to the message. And also in our case, we don't say right from the beginning, best counter narrative ever. We make our videos look like they're coming from ISIS when they're really coming from people that have walked away from ISIS. But in any case, it's really important to be working with Islamic scholars. We have a wonderful one on staff that I'm going to introduce in a few minutes. And we know that while Islamic scholars have over time issued fatwas that allow for suicide terrorism, because suicide terrorism was not always accepted for women's involvement in militant jihad, for women to not have to ask their husbands or their fathers, but to just listen to somebody like their so-called caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, for taking hijra to go live in Muslim lands ruled by Sharia. We know that all of these have come out in fatwas, and for many people, this lends them legitimacy. So who is talking back to this, and how should they talk back? And what does Islam really say about these issues? So today we have Usama Hasan, who is a senior analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. I've known Usama for years now, and he's a wonderful voice working on extremism policy. He specializes in theological arguments to counter Islamist extremism, and his latest report, published on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, is The State of Debate Within Islam, Theological Developments in the Muslim World Since 9/11. He also put out an earlier report that really outlined what were the arguments that jihadists were making and what were the counter arguments, which is very valuable. He's a theological intervention provider for the UK Home Office. He provides one-to-one mentoring for individuals who are radicalized or vulnerable to being radicalized. And since his teens, for 2 decades, Usama was himself a radical Salafi activist, so he knows where these people are coming from. And whilst at Cambridge undergraduate, he briefly took part in the jihad against communist forces in Afghanistan. I'm going to let him tell his own story on that, so I will skip ahead. And then I hope that Sheikh Ali has joined us. Sheikh Ali is on our staff, and I get embarrassed introducing Sheikh Ali because I just think the world of him. And he's an amazing person. He's an Islamic scholar carrying multiple diplomas of Islamic study, has a heart of gold. I just spent a month with him where we spent 2 weeks in the prisons in the Maldives, talking to people that were extremists. And he's so talented at talking to them about Islam and, you know, being able to recite the verses and the hadiths and say, you know, brother, are you sure? Have you considered this? I think you're interpreting that one wrong, or you only have the beginning of that one. How about the end? Or do you know the context of that? And Sheikh Ali and I worked together originally back in Kampuka, and we put together what became the detainee rehabilitation program. And Sheikh Ali worked in it longer than I did, but we were putting together something that was a combination of psychological and Islamic challenge, in the sense that someone like himself would come in and talk to people, particularly the leaders of these groups, which was Al-Qaeda at that time, to walk them back out of it. But, you know, as you walk people back out of believing in Takfir ideology, if they have blood on their hands, then you have all this PTSD because they've no longer done this in the path of Allah. It's a sin, and they have to deal with it both with their conscience inside their religion. So in the Maldives, we had 2 murderers. Sheikh Ali, can I ever be forgiven? What exactly do I have to do for repentance? And it brought tears to my eyes watching how he interacted with people. So I hope Sheikh Ali's here. He's in an unsafe place, so he's not going to speak. He's only going to text. And we turn it over to you now, Usama. And Usama's got a PowerPoint, and he may use the whole hour. We'll see. But Sheikh Ali, you jump in whenever you want. And so let's go from here.
Honor to address all of you. Real thank you to Anne, Molly, the team, and all the participants, of course. Thank you for giving your time. Can you see the slides all right? I've just
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll talk through these. So there's a topic. I'm part of the Extremism Policy Unit at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Now, right. So it's Tony Blair, of course. And of course, he led the UK when 9/11 happened. Of course, and when London was bombed in 2005. So he's seen the worst of this. And I'm going to use the word Islamism a lot. And just to point out, we must always distinguish between Islam and Islamism. They're not the same. Islamism is a political ideology based on Islam. It is also, I would argue, not the same as political Islam, actually. My next paper is distinguishing carefully between what is meant by Islam, political Islam, and Islamism. And to give you a sneak preview, Islamism is basically the most extreme interpretation of political Islam. But that's for a future session, hopefully. But as Sir Tony said, quite rightly, of the billions spent since 9/11 on countering Islamist extremism and terrorism, most of it on military hardware and wars, very little has been invested in tackling the underlying ideology, which is the ultimate source of these issues. And we see that 20 years later, the Taliban are back in power in Afghanistan. Right, so this is a synopsis of my talk, which will be based heavily on my own journey, which has obviously informed my own work in the policy space. And I thank you for plugging my report. There it is, the one Anne mentioned. And our team came up with this brilliant image, which sums things up. There's the Quran, very sacred to all Muslims, even if they're not particularly devout, and you have contested interpretations with a lot of passion there. By the grace of God, like all Imams, pretty much, you memorize the entire Quran. I try to carry my own copy of the pocket Quran with me in my blazer, although we carry it in our hearts at all times. It's close to our hearts. So the fact that a lot of violence, as you said, or murder, massacres are carried out in the name of the Quran and Islam is deeply painful for Muslims, who many of us who now work in this space to try to wrestle back Islam from terrorism. There is the actual cover page, and if you're interested, please do have a look. I'll try to summarize 20 years of theological developments. Now, so I'll start at the beginning. I was born in Nairobi. My parents are from India and Pakistan, African by birth. And this is the Nairobi Central Mosque, a beautiful Indian-style mosque. It is the earliest mosque I can remember. At the age of 4, in the women's section, of course. My earliest memories are sitting with mum in the ladies' gallery, overlooking the main section. Treasured memories at the age of 4, listening to the Quran in Ramadan, actually. My parents then moved to London along with the 5 children, later 6. When I was just under 5 years old, I grew up in North London. And for boys in North London, football is extremely important. And there I was actually a keen footballer, and in the school team or school squad, as you can see there, aged about 11. And as you can see, it's quite multicultural. You have English, Irish, Greek, Turkish, Spanish, Afro-Caribbean, Pakistani kids, highly multicultural. Those who know about football in North London know there's a red and blue half. You might recognize me on the right with my red shorts. Most of my friends were on the blue half of North London, but there we are. We also grew up, apart from football, and going to school and going to mosque and learning the Quran, etc., growing up with racism, a daily occurrence in the 70s and 80s at school, on the streets. Basically grew up afraid of being beaten up, actually, by violent people, both racist, neo-Nazi, white extremists, the National Front, and also the kind of criminals in other communities, whilst facing racism as brown people of Indian Pakistani origin. So I won't go into the details, but for example, my entire family, mum, dad, brothers, sisters, all of us, face racist abuse at, say, the London Central Mosque, top left, the Birmingham Central Mosque on the right, a violent attack on myself and my brothers, violent racist attack. And a tube station, like the subways you have in the United States. We have the tube, our local tube station in North London. I can remember my own mum being racially abused by a person in uniform, an official. He would be sacked immediately now, but this is the 80s we're talking about, 40 odd years ago. Sadly, racism was the norm. So we were treated as outsiders. Go back to where you came from. You're not English, you're Pakistani. The P word was used a lot. You're the wrong color, etc. Now, my own parents, I'm lucky enough to be born into a family where both parents and grandparents, and going back many generations, are all Islamic scholars of Quran and Hadith. Mum and dad and their mums and dads have taught Quran for generations. We're originally from Delhi, and we're linked to the spiritual and intellectual school of Shah Waliullah of Delhi, an absolute intellectual giant who probably hasn't been matched since the 18th century. And he's from India. Now, I was heavily influenced by this map, which is produced by the Islamic Foundation in Leicester, founded actually by my father-in-law, who was a student of Maulana Maududi. This is a Maududist institution, so Islamist, Jamaat Islami. And as I said, I will work later on the difference between political Islam and Islamism. But this influenced me hugely because, as you can see, the countries of the world are colored according to the percentage of Muslims, the population. So you see the green is the Muslim world, basically. And the pink and red is the non-Muslim world. The kafirs is the pejorative term often used, sadly. But there was a strong sense. I'm going to talk later about how we have to take the positives, actually, believe it or not, there are positives of Islamism, and broaden that out. That becomes post-Islamism. One of the positives of this was I knew all the continents and countries, which other kids at primary school had no idea. Anyway, so growing up, you see a lot of amazing things were happening in the Muslim world. And in my latest report, I I'll provide a full timeline from 1979 to 2021, just over 40 years. And these are some of the highlights. And I wrote that timeline from memory because they're just ingrained in my memory as a young lad from primary school days. I was following all this on the news because Dad was obviously interested in all this. There were only 3 TV channels at the time in the UK. So there wasn't much. So you can see what was going on, Iran, Mecca, Afghanistan, Iran-Iraq war, Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hamas, later Saddam in Kuwait, the Bosnian war, closer to home, genocide against Muslims, Srebrenica massacre, 3,000 Muslims, don't forget, men and boys massacred in the heart of Europe in 1995, 6 years before 9/11, same number as Americans killed or people killed in 9/11, the same number killed in Srebrenica. And you see, the world didn't change, sadly, when Srebrenica happened, but it did change when 9/11 happened. And this is part of the problem. But anyway, Kabul, rise of the Taliban, Afghanistan, which for obvious reasons I feel strongly about, because I've been there in a war situation twice, risked my life twice to spend 10 days at a time in Afghanistan. This is from my latest report, the first half of these timeline and events. Now, but moving back to my teenagers, I was lucky enough to go to some of the top private or independent schools in London. My parents sacrificed a lot to send me there because I memorized the Quran by the age of 11. I was, by the grace of God, top of the class in all my studies. And one of the great things, so there we are, City of London School for my A-levels, or what you call high school in the United States, just before university. As you can see, between the River Thames and the iconic St. Paul's Cathedral, the kind of haram, or the most sacred site in Britain, really, in some ways. One of the most important things at secondary school, all boys schools, of course, was meeting Jewish kids for the first time, getting to know Jews. I made a lot of Jewish friends, and I'm still in touch with some of them to this day. And that's been very important, actually, in my own journey. By this time, I was also an imam at our own mosque, the kind of mosque which my parents helped set up, and was the family mosque. I didn't mention that my family background is all Salafis. A very spiritual kind of form of Salafism, very devout, but also very scholarly, devoted to Quran and Hadith studies from a young age. And by this time, I was one of the leaders of the Western world's largest Salafi group called JIMAS. And JIMAS had an alliance with the mosque because we had the same theological understanding of Islam. And as is well known for those who studied this stuff, Quentin Viktorovich was one of the first to write about it in the West. Salafism is a spectrum from the quietest kind of pro-Saudi, like Saudi Arabia until recently. It's changing now with MBS, but Saudi Arabia has been the cradle of Salafism for the last century or so. The quietest Salafism is loyal to the Saudi king. Then you have political Salafism, which is has links with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat-e-Islami, etc. And then you have the outright jihadi or takfiri form of Salafism, which is heavily influenced by Sayyid Qutb and his milestones. And in my experience as a leader of British Salafism, JIMAS and UK Salafis all had complex journeys across the spectrum. So, just basically depending on your experiences and your background and what you saw on TV, what you experienced, you would, and your political inclinations, because not everybody is interested in politics, of course, or understand it. Same with theology, and everybody's so interested in theology. People would move from quietist to political to maybe jihadi and back again. It's all a bunch of journeys. By the grace of God, I went up to Cambridge to study theoretical physics. Attended a couple of lectures by Stephen Hawking and got to meet him in 2011. Rest in peace. So that was great fun. But and later, my master's and PhD were from the University of London. You see my student cards there from Cambridge and London. So now our group had adopted this dress, a turban, Arab-style turban with a robe, long beard, as an identity to physically show that we were different to the non-Muslims. This was an idea we'd adopted, taking directly from Ibn Taymiyyah, the whole book on this. Although unfortunately, we had taken the entire book out of context because Ibn Taymiyyah specifically said this was not for Muslims in a minority context. His book about this, distinguishing yourself, was precisely for Muslim context. But never mind, that's history. So as I mentioned also, once I cycled past Stephen Hawking coming the other way. I wonder what he would have thought in his motorized wheelchair, a Cambridge student in a Roman turban and long beard. But there we are. As Anne mentioned, the leader and founder of our Salafi group was Sheikh Manwar Ali, who is an immense person in this space also. Now, he was very keen on jihad, like all other Islamists at the time. London was a center of kind of Islamist groups from all around the world. But many people talked about jihad without doing it, without practicing what they preached. Sheikh Manwar, took steps and took dozens of members of our group to Afghanistan, and also Bosnia, Kashmir, Chechnya, even Burma, to defend the Rohingya. And of course, we saw this week the US has finally accepted the Rohingya situation as genocide, quite rightly. So I spent 10 days in 1990 to 91 in Afghanistan with Sheikh Manwar and another senior leader of our group. Sheikh Manwar is known as Abu M, the other one is known as Abu A. I'll come back to those. Just remember Abu M and Abu A, and myself, the three. I was Abu Z actually. And if you're interested, listen to Sheikh Manwar. His TED talk had over 1 million views in the first week, so it's well worth listening to him. But this was a kind of scenery, from Cambridge to Kalashnikovs in Afghanistan in the mountains, with the captured Russian tanks in the center of our training camp, etc. Right, to give you an idea, it wasn't just me at Cambridge. During this time, remember the Bosnian War happened. I got to know, with many other Salafis, jihadis, Deobandi jihadis as well. Don't forget, the Salafis get a lot of blame but you don't have to be a Salafi to be a jihadi. The Taliban are Deobandi jihadis, right? And the IRGC in Iran are Khomeinist jihadis, Hezbollah as well. Hamas are kind of Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood type jihadi. So although for understandable reasons, since 9/11, the focus has been on the Salafi jihadis, that's what Al-Qaeda and ISIS generally are. There are many other aspects to this problem which need to be looked at carefully. And then, of course, you've got neo-Nazis, and you've got Hindu fascists and Buddhist fascists trying to carry out massacre. Then you have Jewish fascists as well, or far-right Israeli settlers who were classed as terrorists by the Obama administration. But to give you an example, Omar Sheikh I met at the London School of Economics. And he ended up being the kidnapper of Daniel Pearl. In fact, he was exercised about Bosnia at the time. And I believe I was one of the first to set him on the path to jihad. I said, well, I fought in Afghanistan 2 years ago. If you're really concerned about Bosnia, why don't you go and fight as well? And I actually gave him a number of names, including Abu M and Babar Ahmad on the right, whom I succeeded as president of the Islamic Society at Imperial College in 1993 to 4. Babar was the founder of Azam.com. And spent a number of years in Supermax in the US. He was extradited from the UK, became the longest serving British prisoner without charge because he fought his extradition for 8 years. These are all people at top UK universities who got involved with this kind of thing. Omar Sheikh also went to top London private schools. In fact, the same school as all three of my sons have gone to. So there we are. Now, of course, 90s, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya, Kashmir, I've mentioned, where we lost friends and neighbors, for example. I lost a neighbor in Kashmir to the jihad, an Afro-Caribbean convert to Islam who was killed in Bosnia fighting Serb forces. And we celebrated them as martyrs, and rightly so. But what I would argue is that one wing of the jihad movement became Al-Qaeda, which we had no idea about when we were there in 1990 to 91. We had no idea what Abdullah Azam, or more like Bin Laden, was planning. And so this was a huge shock, actually, obviously, 9/11. I have to admit, I'm ashamed to admit, but I was such an ardent anti-American, kind of anti-Western in my politics as an Islamist, that my immediate reaction, like many others actually, like many thousands of Islamists around the world, was to celebrate the 9/11 attacks as a political strike, the political nature of it, and not the human. We had to block out the fact that thousands of men, women, and children were killed in these attacks. It was a symbolic nature, the anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism that kind of gripped us. And it wasn't confined to the Islamists. There were many leftists or far left who celebrated. For example, South America was a pretty leftist continent at the time. And it was reported at the time that Brazilian football fans were waving Al-Qaeda flags at football matches after 9/11. Right, what happened next is I went off to Pakistan, spent a year there teaching AI for a year. The war on terror was happening next door in Afghanistan. And I actually met jihadis, pro-Al-Qaeda and Taliban, who I realized were politically crazy. For example, one of them talked about not just liberating Kashmir, but the whole of India. And that's when I realized I'd spent 6 years in industry by this time working in AI. I knew something about the way the world works, and I realized that these guys were pretty crazy. I also realized how British and Western I was, actually. A bit of a fish out of water in Pakistan, although was reconnecting with my roots. But that meant I came back to Britain. Now, the Madrid bombings were exactly 2.5 years after 9/11. And I'll show you, see, I'd started thinking, many of us had started re-evaluating our views because we knew something was wrong. We'd supported the Mujahideen, but now they'd attacked the West, our own countries. And they'd murdered men, women, and children, thousands of civilians. Something was clearly not right. Abu Am hadn't celebrated 9/11. He had cried because he's 10 years ahead of me, older than me. He was ahead of me. But I did a lot of soul searching, actually. I went to the first Hajj after 9/11, very emotive. I prayed earnestly at Mecca for guidance, etc., as an imam. And when the Madrid bombings happened, it was my turn to preach on the Friday at the mosque, and I preached against the Madrid bombings. And a couple of men older than me came up to me afterwards with tears in their eyes, and they said, "Thank you, Usama, for correcting us, because we were celebrating the Madrid bombings." And I realized that, oh my God, those chaps are where I was 2.5 years ago, but at least by the grace of God, I've moved on and perhaps helped them to move on. Sorry, in the wrong way. Then, of course, the following year were the 7/7 bombings. And for a Londoner, I think for every Londoner, this was really close to our heart, a real shock. I naively thought this would never happen. The British government and security services were warning it was a question of when, not if. And I naively thought it would never happen, surely. British Muslims like us, we had traveled thousands of miles to Afghanistan, Kashmir, Bosnia, Chechnya to wage jihad. You don't attack your own cities. Britain is a peaceful country. Of course, nobody was going to attack Britain, surely. And the London bombings, of course, proved us completely wrong. There's my current overall boss, of course, so, Tony Blair at the time. He was at the G8 summit in Scotland at the time. And he flew down to London and flew back up to Gleneagles. And as you can see, they made that united front, G8 leaders. You see George Bush behind him. You see the French chap. You see Manmohan Singh of India. You also see Vladimir Putin on the right. So how times have changed. The arguments I use, actually, because I'd gone through this kind of journey myself, and I'd realized certain things about Islamism and how some of our assumptions, our basic assumptions, were completely wrong. And I'd learned that through experience, through learning more about politics, but also learning more about Islam itself, different commentaries of the Quran, seeing different pluralist viewpoints, learning more about the history, actually, of Islam, because Islamists often have a very naive and rose-tinted picture of Islamic history. And my thesis of the 4 pillars of Islamism was first published by the BBC nearly a decade ago, 9 years ago, after the murder of a British soldier, assassination of a British soldier on the streets of London. Now, almost a decade later, yesterday, the trial started of a man who murdered a senior British MP, Sir David Armis, last year. So, in almost a decade, it seems that we haven't moved forward very much. I mean, in policy circles we have, but there is still a lot of public ignorance and even denial in some parts of the political spectrum about these issues. where the same thing is still happening. You know, that was a British soldier was targeted. The chap who's on trial now is for the murder of a leading MP, and the court heard that he had staked out several MPs and actually wanted to murder every single MP who voted for airstrikes in Syria against ISIS. He made up a list of all 523 MPs, for example. That's the scale of things still going on. Right. What are those 4 pillars? I argue that, and I realize I believed in all this stuff. The 4 pillars are Ummah, Khilafah, Sharia, and Jihad. So, and they go in that logical order. It starts with the binary distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims, right? The Ummah, al-wala wal-bara comes into that, loyalty and disavowal. If you define yourself as a separate nation, then you're entitled to a nation state. So the idea of a caliphate or khilafah, Islamic state, kind of naturally follows. Once you have a state needs a law. So Sharia is adopted, the idea of Sharia as a particular interpretation of Islamic law, which will become state law. And finally, jihad, the military aspects of jihad, is adopted as means to defend and expand that Islamic state or caliphate until it conquers the whole world, ideally for Islam. This is the Islamist dream and utopian fantasy, and it amazes me how naive many people in the West are about this or elsewhere. When the Islamists say this openly in their own books and videos all the time, but you just read Sayyid Qutb and other ideologues, they don't hide this, but some people don't want to believe this is true. Okay, and I would argue that these are out of context. But by the way, when I published that, 2 days later, a journalist called Boris Johnson wrote an article saying Islamists want Sharia and other mumbo jumbo. I do believe he was influenced. He might have read my article, but there we are. Now, coming back to the example, this is a terrorist video from just last year, is it? 2021. And this is from one of the many kind of Salafi jihadi African groups, who are active in sub-Saharan Africa and causing havoc. And they're always allied to either ISIS or Al-Qaeda or kind of independent. And this is what this chap, you can see with his fighters there, the black flags. This is what he said in English, in pretty good English actually. Our message to the kuffar non-believers, this is our flag. We are ready to die under the shade of this flag. You are flying the flag of kufr or blasphemy. We are preparing against you to fight for the cause of God. You are fighting to defend Constitution. We are fighting to defend the Quran and the Sunnah, the way of the Prophet. If we die in this fighting, we go to paradise. If you die in this fighting, you go to bonfire. And there was another video actually released earlier this year, very similar. In fact, there's loads of these videos. So, but yet, we have to take this very seriously. Now, remember the Muslim world, you see, I realized that what was green there, you see, this is the ISIS and Al-Qaeda map of the world. This is their ambition to reclaim the Muslim world and eventually to expand it so the black area goes further. You see Andalus, Spain, lost history there, 800 years of Muslim rule or whatever it was. They want to recapture it. India, it's all in black there. A minority Muslim rule in India for many centuries, but there is these kind of utopian visions. Right, so how do you reclaim this? You see, these are the theological arguments, and I'll come to case studies where I have used this approach. That we have to address these 4 notions, but without rejecting them, you see, because they are all Quranic notions. And the Islamists are very successful because many Muslims will not be able to argue against them. It sounds like Quranic language. They quote lots of Quran and Hadith, as Anne was saying. And it kind of makes sense. It seems like it makes sense. So we have to grapple with this. It's no good. I mean, it's important to make platitudinous statements like, Islam is the religion of peace and Muslims reject violence and all that kind of thing. But you can't deny that obviously jihad is part of Islam, and there was war and peace during the time of the Prophet. And we actually have to deal with the Islamist ideology, which is a serious kind of coherent ideology within their own circles. And many intellectuals, many Muslim intellectuals have kind of contributed to that. So, for example, how do you start with ummah? You see, the word ummah means nation. And in Arabic, the United Nations is called Al-Umam al-Muttahida, literally the United Ummahs. And so all the majority Muslim nation of the world, the 50 OIC countries, have all signed up to the United Nations. That is important. The Islamists reject that, you see, to say there's only one Ummah. Now, this is one way to do it theologically. This is the famous book which lists all the words of the Quran, you know. If you look at Ummah, the word Ummah occurs in the Quran exactly 50 times, with another 12 to 15 derivatives. And I would argue that it is never used in the tribal sense that it is used so much now by Islamists. Never. The closest it would get is in 3 verses out of those 50, where it refers to an ethical nation. The Muslims as a virtuous nation, much like the Jewish idea of a light unto the nations. It's very similar, actually, obviously. Islam follows Christianity and Judaism as part of the Abrahamic family. So there's a lot which is common. And I would encourage Muslim scholars, you know, to just take that page from the most famous book, which lists all the Quranic words, and, you know, create articles, sermons based on this to say the word Ummah has many meanings. In fact, I tabulated them here. For example, it's used to mean one nation. Humanity is one nation, right? In Britain, we talk about one nation Tories or one nation politics. Literally, that's Ummatun Wahida politics. There's a sense of all the prophets of God as one nation. That's a strong concept in the Quran. So from Adam, especially Noah, Abraham, Moses, David and Solomon, etc., Mary, Jesus Christ, and the Prophet himself are called one nation, Ummatun Wahida. So there's a pluralism there amongst the world religions. You know, that's all the world religions, not just Abrahamic, but the Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, everyone, Confucius. And so again, that's something for Muslims to consider, and in our theology, to make these ideas well known, because for the last 50, 60, 100 years, the idea of the Muslim as one ummah is just so deeply pervasive, even amongst non-Islamists, that it leads to this division, us versus them. It's a real problem. As Sheikh Hamza Yusuf said to me in the Marrakesh Declaration, you know, we're not supposed to be Banu Islam, we're not a tribe, like the children of Islam. And so obviously tribalism everywhere is a problem, as we know. Your negative tribalism, should I say. The next pillar is Khilafah, Caliphate. And now we just have to simply insist that to a holistic reading of our tradition, and just use logic, there is no Sharia obligation for Muslims to establish a caliphate. Modern nation states and democracies are entirely acceptable in Islamic Sharia. There is no doubt the caliphate existed for 1200, 1300 years. It was the Sunni political model, but it was not divinely revealed. It was a good model for its time. The word Khilafah in the Quran actually refers to doing a duty to God and to ruling with justice and mercy. And I'll come on to other political models which were not other, the way the binary traditional model actually evolved within Islamic history itself. So this is the Islamist view of the world, which is based on medieval Islamic international relations theory, which was very sophisticated. It's called As-Siyar. The great early Muslim jurists came up with international relations theory, 1,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, which was very sophisticated for its time. And they divided the world into Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, and the land of non-Islam, land of the infidels. But the land of the infidels, in amber, could either be yellow, a land of a peace treaty, if you had a peace treaty, or otherwise it would be land of war, Dar al-Harb. And the problem now is that the Islamists, or the violent Islamists, regard wherever they carry out attacks as the red zone, you see, land of war. And it's very important to understand that. Now, there's the famous idea that you should only have one caliph to unite all the Muslims, or for the Shia Islamists, the Khomeinists, the rightful Shia Imam who would unite all the Muslims. And Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, and the jihadi groups promote that idea all the time. But you see, one of the books that changed my life was reading Ibn Khaldun al-Muqaddimah, a British translation. It took me a year of train journeys to read it. Incredible book. He discusses this issue and said, look, it's quite simple. The idea of having one caliph and not having two is where there's division or disunity. But if you've got multiple caliphs in distant lands, there's no problem. And in fact, in Islamic history, there was a famous period where you had the Umayyad caliphs in Spain, in the west. You had the Fatimids, who were Shia Ismaili caliphs in Cairo, and you had the Abbasid Sunni caliphs in Baghdad on the right. There were three simultaneous caliphates, all claiming to be the one caliph or imam for all the Muslims. That's well known. In fact, that's a basis for the pluralism of today amongst Muslim majority nation states. And that's why, as I said, we have to just basically teach Islamic history as well. And now a lot of this work is from Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, one of the leading Sunni theologians of his time, of our time. And he convened a major conference a few years ago in UAE. He does one every year, but actually addressing these critical issues in the one on the nation state model, where where the 200 scholars, I was invited as well, I joined online, categorically stated that there is no need for a caliphate. This was after ISIS had declared theirs, of course. And in bin Bayya's speech to begin with, he lists these 10 or so, and you can see, just look at the dates. They go back over the last 1,000 years. It's not just Ibn Khaldun, in the 14th or 14th century. It's just common sense, actually, because the Muslim theologians were very sophisticated, and the political theologians were as well. And for example, there's Sheikh Abdullah al-Judai, who's from an Ikhwan Muslim Brotherhood background, but who is a student of bin Bayya, who took exactly the same view also. So there is a kind of post-Islamism going on with these discussions, which we need to know about. The other thing which I found in my research is that from my research, I believe it was Ibn Taymiyyah, the controversial kind of Sunni Salafi Imam, who was the first to break the binary distinction of the early scholars. Remember, they had Darul Islam, land of Islam, and land of non-Islam. Well, he was asked about Mardin, a city in modern-day Turkey, which was taken over by the Mongols, the pagan Mongols, and the Tatars. And he was asked, look, the majority of the population is Muslim, the ruler, the non-Muslim. What happens here? Is this a land of Islam or land of non-Islam? And this is a one-page fatwa only. And Ibn Taymiyyah actually made the obvious point, which may seem obvious to us now, but at the time it was revolutionary and groundbreaking in the 13th century. He said it is neither. It has bits of both. It's Dar Murakkab, we call it, a compound or composite land. All right, and again, that opens the door to the complex states that we have, which is what we have today. This is mainstream Islam's view, based actually on Ibn Taymiyyah, and continued after that, where what I'm doing from bottom to up, I'm kind of mapping the old categories to modernity, so that the modern model is a nation state. And as Theresa May, former British Prime Minister, said, it may not be perfect, the modern nation state, but it's the best model we have. As Ambassador Martin Kimani of Kenya, the UN Security Council, said in a brilliant 3-minute speech last week, the best speech anybody's given on Russia, Ukraine at the moment. He also said the same thing, is Africa, it's not ideal that we've been carved up by colonialists with artificial borders drawn between tribes and kind of artificial nations, but it's best to accept them and work with them, because the alternative is bloodshed forever over the tribal land and allegiances and what have you. So we have the modern nation states are the best model we have. The Islamists, I suppose, are a bit like on the left. People are saying no borders, no nations. Yeah, people want to get rid of borders and have I don't know, global rule or something. That's the kind of Islamist dream also, but based on nostalgic reasons. I would argue that the leftists who are making those arguments want a kind of leftist caliphate, a global leftist caliphate, if you like. But anyway, here I'll give an example of bin Bayya, for example, mapping the old stuff, the lands of Islam, lands of non-Islam, composite lands, approximately to today. For example, he says Nigeria, and there are other countries which have federal systems where, the northern states of Nigeria have Sharia, and the southern states don't, which are Christian, and then you have mixed Muslim Christian states. So it's very important to talk about this political stuff. Now, or Islamic political philosophy, should I say. The Sharia aspects, it's very important to realize Sharia is law and ethics intertwined. I translated there in ethical law. Ibn al-Qayyim of Damascus, actually a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, very importantly, another major kind of Salafi but also Sufi source. He said Sharia is about justice, mercy, wisdom, and the common good. And anything that goes against that is not Sharia. So injustice, harshness, mischief or stupidity or nonsense is not Sharia. And that's a basic empowering thing for Muslims, to think about the basic principles and the ethics and not get bogged down in great details, which only theocrats or clerics like those of the Taliban or the Ayatollahs or the Shari'is of ISIS know and implement and force on other people, which somehow Muslims are supposed to accept. So I won't get too much on that. Jihad, of course, has many aspects, well known inner and outer jihad, jihad with the tongue. But ultimately, jihad, a holistic reading in the Quran shows, and Ibn Taymiyyah again says this as well, despite the fact, he took part in military jihad against the Mongols. He roused the local armies to help defend Syria and Egypt against the Mongol invasion. But as he said, ultimately, jihad, the word means to struggle. It's ultimately a struggle for good against evil at all levels, social, individual, communal, political, etc. And jihad is ethics. The Prophet taught you don't kill non-combatants, you don't cut down trees, you don't poison wells, you don't use fire, you don't burn your enemies, etc. It's very strong ethical teachings from the Prophet himself. And I would argue that modern Islamic warfare ethics basically are consistent with international agreements such as the Geneva Conventions. And the previous work that I referred to, which Sheikh Salah, my colleague, wrote, Salah al-Ansari, I did most of the editing, if you like. We argued through that refutation of ISIS's fiqh al-dima, which was their jurisprudence of blood. Our last section, in 2 pages, we came up with 15 points of modern Islamic warfare ethics, which is worth reading if you don't want to read the whole 100-page essay.
Usama, will I throw you off if I ask you a question here? Because
I've nearly finished. Can I just?
Okay.
I'm nearly finished. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And for that essay, we also have 10 truths about jihad at the beginning, 10 principles. Anyway, so this is my kind of post-Islamism. You see, for myself, I would describe myself as a post-Islamist, and in some sense, a post-Salafi, a kind of Salafi Sufi. I've taken those 4 principles. On the right, I've given what I regard as Islamist extremist interpretation, which are problematic in red. In the middle, I've got the more inclusive interpretations. And I use them. I won't go through the Kenya example, but I'll come back to that. I've got various ideas. But what I'll do, this is a graphic from the State of Debate report, which again summarizes the fact that these are contested, you see. On the left in green, I've got modern inclusive interpretation. On the right, I've got medieval divisive ones. But the Muslim world has to have these core discussion and the wider world as well, because it affects all of us. And finally, I want to finish with some case studies. 2 of them are 1 and 2 are from my colleagues. I won't name them because it's confidential, of course, but we're all imams and kind of activists who fought jihad ourselves. To one of them, a young Brit came and said he wanted to bomb a bus. And my friend actually just talked to him and taught him about Islam and the nature of Islam and jihad, etc. And explained to him why this was completely wrong. This would be terrorism, not jihad. He would go to hell, not heaven. And he talked him out of it. Another one came to another colleague, said he wanted to poison London's water supply. I think he might have studied chemical engineering or something. Again, my colleague Sheikh talked him out of it. The final one is one I dealt with, which I can talk about because it was not a Home Office one. It was a UK teenager who joined the ISIS networks online, and I was having great fun, on Facebook, and very naive, learning, meeting all these fierce jihadi fighters. One of the, I read all of his transcripts. One of the most interesting messages he said was he was in touch with an ISIS fighter, and he said, "Can you please send me an audio recording? I just want to hear what a jihadi fighter sounds like," because he had this romantic idea. Anyway, he ended up in prison when the police got him. And what I did was spend 4 or 5 sessions, 1 on each of the 4 principles, 2 hours at a time, explaining, look, you believe in this stuff like I did. Ummah Khilafah Sharia Jihad. Look, here are some different interpretations. What do you think? And by the way, on that, I'm very inspired by one of the Prophet's teachings that people are mirrors of each other. So when I see this young man who's got into huge trouble because he believes in all this Islamic stuff, I see myself as an angry young man at his time, rather naive. And when I explained this to him, when he said to me, he said, "Why didn't anybody explain this to me before?" There was another one case like that as well. It's like, I've now got a terrorism conviction. It's ruined his life, and the family, of course, parents, utterly distraught, all the social problems which he'll have. It's like, why didn't anybody explain this to me before? And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much to all of you. Anne, you wanted to ask me a question, I think. You're muted, Anne. Anne, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Usama. I'd like to get down to some of the nitty-gritty because when I sit with these guys, and I've sat with hundreds of them, I'm thinking particularly of, it was one of the 7/7 bombers that went off to Kenya. I'm sure you know who he is, who joined Al-Shabaab. I talked to him in prison there. And I wished I had Sheikh Ali by my side because I couldn't argue any of these things. I don't have enough knowledge. I know what they're talking about, but I can't refute it. And you quoted really good things from Ibn Taymiyyah, but so often they're quoting this to me, telling me that all the leaders of Maldives, all the leaders of India, all the leaders of wherever they happen to be are Taghut. In the case of ISIS, that they got convinced that they have to take Hijra and that they have to follow Wala al-Bara. How do you answer this?
Well, it needs a lot of patience and it needs a lot of contextualization to say, those teachings are there. What do they mean in today's context? What does Wala al-Bara mean for Brits or Americans? Mm-hmm. And the basic point really is that they have to understand, or one of the basic points is, we have to understand that we are no longer living in the medieval world where the whole world accepted divisions based on religion. So, you had the idea of Christendom in Europe, right? When the Crusades were fought on a religious basis from the Christian world against the West, the world of Islam, the Muslim world. But humanity has moved on from that. And the great leaders of Muslim countries as well have done so. That's a crucial point. So that Wala al-Bara is not Muslim v non-Muslim. It's good versus evil. So you see the Ottoman Caliph, actually 200 years ago, this is a Sultan Mehmet, is it? Who was influenced by the American and French Revolution and the ideas of citizenship. And he said this nearly 200 years ago. The only difference for my citizens, is Muslim goes to mosque on Fridays, Christian goes to church on Sundays, Jew goes to synagogue on Saturdays. Otherwise, there's no different. You're all equal. The Ottomans came up with, Ottomanism, the Ottoman citizens. Pakistan, famously, this is Jinnah's famous speech at partition, where he talks about the citizenship in the public space. Hindus and Muslims are united. Even the Indian Muslims talked about the united faith of India, those who stayed with India. So these are actually not new ideas. They've kind of been lost under the rise, under the attack of fundamentalism and Islamism. And also, of course, don't forget the context. So another case I dealt with was Thomas Evans, the British chap who converted to Islam. He split up with his girlfriend and Islam gave him some peace, but he went with the wrong people, ended up joining Al-Shabaab in Somalia. I was in contact with his mum while she was still in contact with him, right? She married a 13-year-old girl.
They so often stay in contact with their moms. That's a good way to get to them, yeah?
Yeah, so she was in touch with him still. And he would call her every so often. Mm-hmm. And sometimes ask for money and she couldn't send. So what I did was I actually showed her, printed out for her 2 hadith of the Prophet, both of which talked about, both for hijrah and jihad, sacred migration and jihad, that however lofty those are in the right context, that he was convinced he had the right context, you cannot do that when you have to serve your parents, because, in Islam, honor your parents is the 2nd commandment after worship God alone. I believe in the Old Testament it's the 4th commandment or so, but in the Quran it's the 2nd commandment. And there's very famous teachings that even something as important as Hijrah and Jihad, even assuming if his interpretation was correct or Al-Shabaab was the right group to go for, which clearly isn't, that he should come back and save his mum because, their dad had left the mum at a young age and he was the elder of the two boys. She actually read out those two hadiths to him on the phone. The last ditch attempt, that's the only thing we could have tried. Sally Evans did, and she told me that he was too entrenched in the camaraderie and the propaganda that he said, no, Mum, those don't apply here. This is a different context. So sadly, we failed in that attempt, but we did try.
I'm really glad you tried. I want to read what Sheikh Ali said because he doesn't want to speak. And he's saying it seemed, and I also put in the chat for people to go to the realjihad.org if they want to see arguments that are really specific to the claims that jihadists make. And your book too, Usama, your first book is so good on that. I haven't read the second one yet. But here's Sheikh Ali. It seems that Islam answers to what is available at every specific period in history. The philosophy of the Ummah and the Islamic State concept was an answer to the environment which had empires that existed at that time, taking into consideration all the threats to the newly born state. So there's no strict model in Islam of the Islamic State in Islamic jurisprudence. It is a political view which is developed within the given time and potentials. I don't know if you would agree with that, Usama, but I know that I did watch Sheikh Ali argue people out of it. And it, like you said, you're trying to argue through this mother and she can't keep going at him because she's not you. But it does sometimes shake people up enough that if they want to be in the path of Allah, they're like, well, wait a minute, maybe I'm on the wrong path, which I think is extremely powerful if you have that knowledge to do that.
Thank you. And this is all we can do is try to share these ideas. You see, that's why I urge many of my Muslim brothers and sisters who are listening, many of whom have also been Islamists or still are, or are certainly familiar with these discussions and know how powerful they are, but also know how we've all seen how destructive these ideas are when taken wrongly. Whereas I argue, I believe in those four principles, but I have what I would regard as inclusive and better interpretations of these ideas than the Islamists have, and it will take decades of dialogue, it seems to me, to unpack all of these issues, because you have to go through all the kind of centuries of jurisprudence and Islamic political thought, and you have to deal with Sayyid Qutb. I mean, I'd love to write a polite conversation to Sayyid Qutb because he's clearly a very passionate and sincere person.
So we see your next book. We see your next book.
Maybe. And by the way, I entirely agree. From what I think you said, Sheikh Ali, the caliphate for the Islamists is the divinely revealed perfect system. For the Khomeinis, it's the imamate, as Khomeini himself regarded his government as literally the direct rule of God on earth. But we would argue that no, it was a brilliant political system for its time, which the Prophet's companions kind of came up with, and it was very good, and it was a great system. But given that the Muslim world itself kind of abandoned it or realized it was now obsolete, it's been a century or so, nearly a century. In 2 years' time, the Islamists will have the centenary commemoration probably of the end of the Ottoman Caliphate. But that'll be a good time to revisit all these issues. Well, but we should discuss it from now because, so all of these things are up for grab, really, basically. What does Ummah mean in our time and around the world? What does Khilafah mean, or Islamic State, or Caliphate, Imamate for Shia Islamists? What does Sharia mean? And human rights, etc. What does jihad mean? These are the conversations I hope will continue in Friday sermons, Islamic study circles, books, writings, social media, and so we can hope to raise the literacy level or the understanding of these things, so that in future you don't get the Thomas Evans and the others who run away. And we've had success with it. One of the guys involved in the Toronto cell, he wrote to us saying. He de-radicalized in prison, and thank you for your writing. That's myself and my colleagues. He thanked. We had Muhammad Khan, the youngest terrorist convict in the United States. He also kind of de-radicalized and doing very well as a young scholar, very, very brilliant guy. But unfortunately, he fell into this trap when he was younger. It would be very interesting to see Babar Ahmad and Omar Sheikh. Babar Ahmad is out of prison, Omar Sheikh is still in prison. But from what I know, they've been on their journeys as well. They're highly intelligent people. Babar Ahmad is finishing his book, and I'm in touch with him, conversations around these issues. As Abu Qatada has retracted just this year or last year his ridiculous.
He retracted with us in my interview of him. He said he did not endorse terrorism, and I was like, "Are you really saying this? Can I print this? It's on our website." And,
congratulations, then. Well, thank you for doing that. Amazing.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. It was a couple of years ago. But yeah, but here's an issue. I mean, when we were looking at the ISIS guys, over 200 of them, and a lot of them in prison, we saw something that we called spontaneous de-radicalization, that they got just disgusted with ISIS and learning more of the truth of its corrupt and un-Islamic nature, and walked away from it. They didn't get all the way to a point where I would say they're healthy and totally de-radicalized, because they were more concerned with that ISIS had lied to them and harmed them than being aware of and wanting to do something to repent for the harm that they had done by joining ISIS and being a cog in a machine. But we did see this spontaneous de-radicalization, and now you're speaking of 2 cases in prison that just based on, sounds like reading your works, de-radicalize themselves. What do you usually find? I mean, you're on one hand saying it's going to take generations of teaching, but then we see these people that flip. I mean, they also flip the other way. And I keep getting so tired of listening to people saying de-radicalization is a invalidated concept. And I think, no, that's not true. Cognitive behavioral therapy is very well proven and evidence-based. And we know that people's cognitions are really interwoven in their faith if they are people of faith. So I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit.
Well, thank you, Anne. I know you're a psychologist or professor of psychology as well or something. And that is really important for psychologists to work with theological and ideological experts, because we're seeing this argument all over the world. Actually, we had a big argument within the UK government, it's still going on, as to whether these, terrorism is driven by purely psychology or purely ideology. And it seems to me it's a no-brainer. I mean, clearly both are involved. I mean, in fact, the UK's PREVENT programme, the vulnerability assessment framework and the extremism risk guidance uses 22 factors to assess how radicalized a person is or vulnerable. And 13 are psychological hooks, 4 or 5 are ideological factors, and the remainder are logistics. So, we're not claiming that it's all ideology, clearly, because human beings, the psychology, like in my own case, trauma, racism, etc., it was like that helped push me away from the Western, of integrating into the West, because we were basically told you're not welcome, and also had a strong pull from a devout Muslim and Islamist background. So we really need to continue working together, because obviously the psychologist insights are huge, but also we cannot ignore this very clear ideology, which to me explains, there's a very simple reason. Some people pretend that ideology doesn't matter, and even top psychologists in Britain say it's all psychology. It's when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like, is a nail. It's that kind of situation where if it's only psychology, then why do these people go to the length of becoming really extreme violent, suicide bombing, killing themselves? Because most actually young people in Britain and around the world in cities who have these issues end up being gang members, right? Violent gangs. But what takes somebody from a relatively low level violence of gang to wanting to massacre hundreds or thousands of random people, and also willing to blow themselves up, as you said, suicide bombing in the process, that's a different level of threat that we're talking about. And to my mind, it's a no-brainer that the ideology is really powerful. And I think the people who understand this and already have done, have taken the most effective actions against all of this.
Thank you for that. I have another question, but I see that Royce DeMello has a few questions. He's saying what Sultan Mehmet said at one time does not apply historically. Different sultans, different behavior, beliefs, Islamic expansion under Turkish leadership happened. And does Byzantium exist today? The Crusades were in part to stop that expansion, a counteroffensive, which probably can be argued. The taking of Christian boys to become Muslim slave warriors was an Ottoman Islamist policy. And then he is asking, how do you explain Sahih al-Bukhari 6924? I'm going to give you one other question with this, which is unrelated, but you can answer both, is these days we see people radicalized really quickly to carry out mass murders. And do you see a baseline of ideological beliefs that are in support of violent jihad being spread throughout society? And what do you think we can do about that? So there's two tough questions for you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll quickly scribble them down before I forget. There's three questions there, I think. So the Ottoman history is fascinating because that was the last major caliphate, right? Because we had, in Islamic history, you had the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and later the Fatimids, you had the Mughals, you had all kinds of empires who claimed to be caliphs. But the Ottomans were the last, and they were a modern state. They saw themselves as a European state, in fact, a Western state. So those last 200 years are very interesting. I mean, I've written about them before, and there's many great scholars like Ehsanoglu and Ahmed Kuru and others who have written about this. What is very clear from that quote that I put up, that was part of the Tanzimat reforms, it's very clearly influenced by the American and French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, because this is like first half of the 19th century they're doing this. And then, of course, the Ottomans became the sick man of Europe, and they allied with the Germans First World War, and that sealed their fate. And of course, then they went to secularism with Ataturk, a very militant secularism, should we say, an intolerant one. And now you have Erdogan, who is either a kind of religious nationalist or an Islamist, Islamist roots. But this is natural. This is what will happen in societies, and the same happens in other countries like Pakistan. I've written about Pakistan under Jinnah. I gave Jinnah's vision, but it became very different under, say, General Yahya Khan and Ayub Khan. But then under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, it was looking towards socialism and even communism. Under General Zia, it became more Islamist again. Pervez Musharraf talked about enlightened moderation, and he in charge after 9/11. Imran Khan again is, I would say, a religious nationalist, which is who is influenced by Islamism as well. So all of these issues come out of those four concepts, actually, which is the answer for the last question. I mean, you said, are there any basic ideological beliefs? Well, these are it. I would argue that you see the intellectuals, the leaders of these Islamist movements, including the terrorist movements, they are all highly intellectual people. I mean, Bin Laden was an engineer, Abdullah Azzam was an Islamic scholar. Ayman al-Zawahiri, he's a pediatrician. He's not the intelligent people. And as I mentioned, many of our recruits from Britain and America were from the top universities. The foot soldiers, if you like, are often don't know these details, but they do know these basic ideas. I can guarantee you that. You talk about normal Islamists, even the ones who are going off to ISIS with a copy of Islam for Dummies and that kind of thing. They have this basic idea that it's us versus the non-Muslims, that we must have our own state, the caliphate, right? Daesh, that Sharia, we must live by the Sharia and our loyalty to Sharia, and of course about jihad. And the final question about Sahih al-Bukhari, I'm sorry, we memorize the original text, we don't memorize numbers, right? So in the Quran, we memorize the entire text. You'd have to tell me the hadith itself. But what I will say is that we need more internal criticism of the hadith literature, which has begun, and I say this from a strongly hadith background. So for example, my latest blog piece on my personal blog is critiquing the hadith of Bukhari, which says, Aisha was only 6 years old when she married the Prophet and 9 at consummation. I mean, that's a hugely problematic hadith, of course, and it leads to extremely insulting words being used about the Prophet himself, which pains a lot of Muslims, which is another grievance of radicalization. And in fact, there's an ISIS chap who's in prison in the UK at the moment. Well, he tried to join ISIS. He was intercepted at the airport, I think, and he's still in prison. And he was on record, this came out on the trial, that he'd stated that he wanted to marry a young girl, a 7-year-old if possible, or a 6-year-old. So unfortunately, that hadith of Bukhari, which is actually clearly completely wrong, and hundreds of hadith scholars have critiqued it, leads to problems. And the other example, for example, Sahih Muslim. Sahih Muslim is a hadith mentioning A'maq and Dabiq, right, which is where ISIS directly took their magazine name from. Those hadith talk about early battle between the Muslims and the Byzantine Empire, or the Romans, I should say, in Syria, right? It's well known. There were major clashes, and there were battles at A'maq and Dabiq. The Ottomans also fought a battle at Dabiq, the famous Ottoman Battle of Dabiq. Our problem is that those hadiths, which I would argue were fabricated at the time to try to give a kind of divine sanction to the Muslims, are still being taught by the hadith scholars 1,000 years later to say this is going to happen in the future. And this is what ISIS used to imagine that they're going to be the people at the apocalypse, or Armageddon, on the right side, on the Muslim side. Another example is the black flags. I've written about that on my personal blog as well. I mean, my dad is a hadith scholar and he did an in-depth study of the black flags hadith. And again, all this stuff about black flags from the east, from Khorasan, to support the Mahdi, this is all from early Islamic history, because it was the Umayyads were defeated by the Abbasids, and guess who the Abbasid general was? His name was Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. He was from Khorasan, and his army came with what? Black flags, right? And it's very clear, anybody who looks at it objectively, that these hadith about black flags from the east, from Khorasan, coming to establish God's law on earth, were fabrication at the time, Abbasid fabrications, as propaganda against their opponents, the Umayyads. And the Muslim world generally has to have a very, very serious, overhaul and critique of the vast corpus of hadith literature, which is already happening actually. There's lots of that work going on, but it needs to continue. So, thank you for that question, because you brought up the hadith issue. I'm sorry. I don't know which particular hadith you're referring to, but it all needs to be looked at.
Sheikh Ali jumped in on direct message and said his next blog, which I think will be coming out this afternoon on therealshahad.org, also is looking at Bukhari. So interesting that you're both blogging on the same thing right now. That's cool.
Another hadith, there's 2 hadith on killing apostates. You see, people who leave Islam. Now, I covered these in a short essay I wrote almost a decade ago called No Compulsion in Religion, Islam and the Freedom of Belief, which is obviously a famous verse of the Quran, La ikraha fi din, no compulsion in religion. It occurs immediately after the greatest verse of the Quran, which is Ayatul Kursi, the verse of the throne. Immediately after this most majestic verse of the throne, you have La ikraha fi din, no compulsion in religion. Anyway, there's 2 hadith which I discussed, and I was pleased to see Mustafa Akyol in his latest book on liberty also points to the same 2 hadith. One which says that the death penalty is only appropriate in 3 cases. One of them is a person leaving his faith, abandoning Islam and abandoning the community. The second one says, however he changes his religion, kill him. And those are both extremely problematic hadith. And I discussed them in my essay, which has been translated into 17 languages, by the way. It's on my academia page if anybody's interested. But in a nutshell, there's a huge context around those. The first one was understood to be political treason. That's the only possible understanding of it, because that was at a time where your faith community affiliation was your political affiliation. You see, Muslim, Jew, Christian, whatever. The second one, Taha Jabir al-Alwani, I summarize his argument that it could be related to a verse of the Quran where people were changing their religion outwardly to try to deceive believers and try to get them to leave Islam. That's the only possible meaning. But you see, our literalist tradition, or even the madhabist tradition, needs to be critiqued, because this hadith, which ISIS and Al-Qaeda were daubing on the walls of Syria and Iraq, whoever changes his religion, kill him. Man baddala dinahu faqtuluh. The Shafi'i scholars, many of them, said this applies to a Jew becoming a Christian or vice versa. So you have to kill them. It wasn't just Muslim leaving Islam. So they applied changing a religion, kill the person, to every change of religion except a person converting to Islam. I mean, which is completely crazy. And even Imam Nawawi supported this because he was Shafi origin. Now, Muhammad Rashid Rida, one of the Salafi leaders of the 20th century, he critiqued Imam Nawawi, saying Imam Nawawi is just supporting this because he's Shafi, and he needs to, he needs to understand this is clearly not right. But of course, we have this problem within Islam where you get sacralization of the tradition. And in fact, one of the positives of Salafism is that it doesn't sacralize the entire tradition. It's more critical. It says we have all of these, not just 4 imams, but dozens of imams, but we have to try to find out what is correct and just from the spirit of mercy of the Quran and the Prophet, peace be upon him. And there's no doubt the essential spirit and teaching of the Quran is mercy. Every single chapter, except one, begins with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, all merciful, most merciful. The Prophet is described as nothing but a mercy to the world. God says, my mercy overcomes my anger, that's overcomes my wrath, and my mercy encompasses everything. So the message of mercy and compassion is absolutely fundamental. And the greatest metaphysical Sufi writer, Ibn Arabi, is described in books today as the unlimited mercifier, for example. His whole Sufi thought is based on that principle of mercy. So what I would argue, there's no doubt about that. And Muslims have to reevaluate our entire tradition. And as Ibn al-Qayyim said, get rid of the harshness and nonsense and replace it with wisdom and mercy, which are names and attributes of God as well.
So here's my last question to you, because we're going to run out of time, and it's not an easy one, but I'm curious. It seems to me that, the concept of suicide terrorism got spread very widely in the sense that it was validated as an Islamic act of martyrdom. So many things have been spread, mostly through, first it was chat rooms. I remember Reuven Paz watching all the chat rooms and talking about the University of Jihad. And now it's social media and Telegram and encrypted apps. But it seems to me that the people promoting militant jihadist interpretations of Islam are winning. How do we win back without waiting 50 years? Because people are radicalizing quickly. And, these examples you gave of wanting to poison the water supply, blow up a bus, some of these people get talked into it in a matter of a week or two, which tells me that there must be some ideological foundation that's been spread throughout society that, you don't have to spend 6 months talking somebody into something anymore. They already accept a lot of it.
Thank you for that sobering question. And I'd actually be more optimistic. The cases of the would-be bus bomber and the poisoner of London's water supply was a good 15 to 20 years ago. It was in the early years after 9/11. And I've not heard such a thing more recently. Obviously, there are still problems, as the murder of the MP showed, and ISIS, etc. But, a lot of people have been disillusioned because of ISIS. Clearly, and one way to leave.
That's good. I mean, we had one person, when we wrote our paper on spontaneous de-radicalization, we wrote about one woman who said, I didn't need a de-radicalization program. ISIS was the best one around.
What exactly? And if I can share something, when we were in Afghanistan, 1990 to 91, the Soviets had left, but the jihad continued against the Soviet-backed communist regime. When Kabul fell in 92 to the Mujahideen, we celebrated. I celebrated with Cambridge University students, Islamic Society guys. And what would come next? Well, you see, naively, we thought the Mujahideen would unite and you'd have an Islamic state of Afghanistan, which would then unite and merge with the Islamic republics of Pakistan and Iran next door. And that would be the beginning of the caliphate. This would expand. And you see the next 4 years were a reality, a touch of reality, because what happened next was a vicious civil war between the Mujahideen. It is said that Kabul was bombed far more by Hikmatyar's forces than the Soviets ever did, right? And that was a powerful lesson. In fact, we'd heard of a bit of infighting amongst the Mujahideen while we were there, actually, which is really quite shocking. And that continues. And I've used that to help de-radicalize. There's a young guy who wanted to go to Syria. He was obsessed with going to Syria. He was autistic as well, so it's quite difficult to get through to him. But I mean, for somebody not trained in dealing with autistic people like myself. But what did work is I showed him the pictures of the Al Qaeda and ISIS commanders who were killed by each other's forces. And I said, look, what do you want to go to Syria? They're killing each other like they did in Afghanistan in the 90s. And sorry, there was one more point. It escaped my mind. It might come back to me. But I would actually be more optimistic. I would say, you know, these discussions are there. What you see in front of you, those 4 principles. What I was going to say is one way of leaving Islamist extremism is for people to leave Islam, you know, and tens of thousands of people are doing that. I mean, young Muslim leaving Islam is becoming a big problem for the Muslim community right across the Muslim world, not just in the West. For those of us who actually do believe in one God and the message of the Prophet and the Quran, etc., and also recognize that, you know, the Islamists have their background and their grievances. This is why I talk about an exit ramp in reclaiming Islam from extremism and having these theological discussions, because that's why I've found to preserve my own faith away from the disillusionment from extremism and all the infighting, and therefore that's a collective endeavor for the Muslim world. This is why the leading Muslim theologians as well, Ibn Bayyah and others, and all of his students are involved with this, because we want to preserve. We believe there is immense goodness in the scriptures, in faith, in religion done properly, especially in the Quran and the way of the Prophet. But it's a difficult task with scripture. You know, it's not an easy task, but it's a sacred task. It's a really important task worldwide right now, which is why we are continuing. Oh yes, I want to talk about suicide bombing. So I think we need to talk about that quite directly, and just be honest about it. Is that anybody in a war situation, if you're surrounded by your enemy and you're about to be, they're going to shoot you dead, and you have some bombs with you, you know, any soldier would say, I'm going to die, I might as well take out as many enemy soldiers as I can. And they will do that. Of course, the first suicide bombers in the modern period were the Japanese pilots, of course, kamikaze bombers, the whole tradition of harakiri amongst the samurai. Then it was a Tamil suicide bombing in India, and then the Islamists adopted that, starting with Hezbollah in the 1980s in Lebanon against the American and French forces with those truck bombs. And then it became, sadly, a kind of daily tactic used by all these groups. But you see, in Europe, we're seeing the Russia-Ukraine war is horrific, but it has opened up these issues. For example, we've got hundreds of Brits wanting to go and fight the Russians. And it's reminiscent of the 1990s, where hundreds of us thousands wanted to go and fight the Serbs in Bosnia. It's the same thing. They're not necessarily, you're not evil if you want to go and fight in a just cause. Last week, there's a major news story about a Ukrainian soldier who was described as a hero. He blew up a bridge, but blew himself up as well. There was a bridge which the Russians were going to cross, and he stopped them from crossing. The only way he could do that was to take himself with the bridge. So there you have a Ukrainian suicide bomber who is, being celebrated as a martyr by all the pro-Ukrainian side, which is the vast majority of Europe, and kind of quite rightly so. And I think we have to have those difficult discussions around suicide bombing. It is a tactic. It is problematic in theology because suicide is generally forbidden in Islam. You know, I'm not, and of course the vast majority of the suicide bombers have attacked civilians, and it's the target which is wrong. But suicide bombing is actually merely a tactic of war, which any soldier would tell you in an extreme situation, if there's no other option, then you do that.
I think you have to distinguish.
It's the target. If
you're going to be killed, do you allow yourself to kill others while you're being killed? But we've come to the end of our time, and I'd like to finish with underlining the idea that we're all one ummah. And thank you for that. And that we see Islam as a religion of mercy and peace, and try to promote that as much as we can. And I hope you'll send us the link for your blog, because we'll include it in the chat that we mail out to everyone later today. And I'm glad, because we support Sheikh Ali to be on the internet, and like to support you too, and everyone else that's fighting against the militant jihadist interpretations of Islam that are poisoning people. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
Thank you for having me, and everybody for listening. It's been an honor.
You're welcome. Okay, so we quit for today, and thanks to everybody for coming. Bye-bye.